All right guys, it's time for another industrial sewing machine showdown. This time we're pitting the Pfaff 145 high lift against a Juki LU 563. Now I don't have a particular dog in the fight, but I'm really curious to see which one of these compound feed walking foot machines will come out on top sewing thick leather in a variety of situations. Stick around, we'll get into it. So we're going to put these machines through their paces. We'll start with the Pfaff 145, and again this is the H4 variant. The little placard on the front of the machine says CLPMN, so those are the specifics. You can look at my All Things Pfaff 145 video for an explanation of what all those initials mean, but they further detail the specs on the machine. And again, this is the H4 version. That's the high lift. So you might notice your machine says either H3 or H4. H3 is the standard lift, H4 is the high lift variety. We're working with the high lift, and I think that matters in terms of how high the presser foot lifts, but also how high the steppage is when you adjust that wing nut on the back of your machine for maximum steppage. The H4 has a little bit of an advantage over the H3 there as well. So not just the overall height you can lift the presser foot, but how high the feet step when you're at the maximum range. A couple of things I'd like to test with both of these machines. One will be a test of control. So we've got this little cork-backed veg tan leather shapes, and what we'll do is we'll sew around the edge of them to assess the control of the machine. Now, I will say control of a machine is typically related more to the type of motor that you have on the machine and the size of the pulleys that you're running, but these machines are both running servo motors. So 550 watt, regular analog servo motors. They've both got small motor pulleys on them. One disclaimer is the Juki 563 does have a speed reducer in addition to that servo with small motor pulley. So the Juki will be running slower. It will have more punching power. So we'll take that into consideration as we compare these two machines. But the main test I want to do is just to see how many layers of 2.5 ounce chrome tan leather that we can sew through. Now this is chrome tan leather that's very common in the upholstery industry. It's just kind of a medium weight. It's not particularly thick like a veg tan leather. When I'm sewing cushions or backrest cushions for rockers or antique Morris chairs, I usually run into the situation where I don't just have 2 layers that I'm sewing together, but with the piping in the middle, I would have 4 layers to sew through. And then at that point on a backrest cushion where you have a strap inserted into the seam, that would push you up to sometimes 8 layers. So I want to get into that range, 8 layers or even more of this 2.5 ounce leather, and see how these machines perform. Okay, just a quick check that our tensions are balanced here. We'll hold our threads back and start sewing a little bit. And what I'm sewing with here is just 2 layers of 2.5 ounce upholstery leather. And I've got green thread on the top and beaver color thread on the bottom. And that way we can have an easy look and see if we're balanced or not. So we'll go ahead and release that out and take a look. And it looks like I need a little more upper tension. We'll get that sorted. You want to balance your tension in just 2 layers, the thinnest possible thing that you would sew in, just 2 layers. If you can balance your tension there, you know you're going to be fine once you get into thicker layers for the test. All right, let's look at control of the Pfaff. So here we have our veg tan leather, and this is glued with contact cement to a cork backer. Okay, overall thickness is about 3/16 of an inch, and so it's not going to be really much of a test for the punching power of the machine. More just a test of the control and see how well I can walk around the edges. Okay, leave my needle buried, lift my presser foot, and continue on down the next side. Now with that servo motor and small motor pulley, that really does give me an advantage that it's not like a clutch motor where I feel like it might race away from me. Okay, we're doing good so far. We'll come down this next edge. And that's about as slow as I can comfortably go. But the motor, the servo motor, does have a speed dial on the bottom that will limit the top speed to my liking. Of course, there is a point where if you turn it down too low, you lose some of your punching power with a 550 watt motor. Reverse it a little bit, and we'll come out of this stitch here. Okay, so looks like I was able to follow that just fine. The one thing I notice here with this veg tan leather, I don't know if you can pick it up, but there's so much pressure under the foot of the Pfaff that it is marking up the veg tan leather here. It's kind of dragging a line where the presser foot is down and kind of engaging with the leather. Not a big deal if you're with chrome tan leather, but something that you might notice or have to repair if you're sewing with a Pfaff on veg tan leather. Some models are easier to adjust in that regard. My model has an internal tension spring. It's very hard to adjust. It's very hard to lessen that tension. It really wants to have a stiff action. I mean, you'll get little marks in your finger just from lifting the presser foot manually because there's that much spring pressure. Versus some other 145s and 545s have that external leaf spring on top of the machine. Those are very easy to adjust, and you could easily solve this problem. Same thing with the Juki. It runs at a much lighter pressure that comes down across the presser foot, and that's also easy to adjust. So let's start with a little torture testing with the Pfaff here. Let's just fold this over and start with 2 layers. 2 layers of 2.5 ounce chrome tan leather. We'll sew around the perimeter of this, and then we'll start folding it in half and go on to the 4 layers. I don't notice any jackrabbit starts with this. It's pretty easy to control. No speed reducer, but a good servo motor with a small motor pulley. And when I say small motor pulley, I just mean a 45 millimeter pulley is usually what I like to have on my machine. No resistance at all to punching through 2 layers of this 2.5 ounce leather. Okay, so there we're through 2 layers. Let's trim some loose threads here, double it up, and see how we do with 4 layers. There we go, 4 layers. And look at that high lift. It just has no trouble getting up and above that 4 layers of leather. That's a nice advantage there. So we're looking for any mechanical resistance, things like the needle bar actually conking the presser feet because the presser feet are being forced up too high with thick material. We're not seeing any of that. Also just physical difficulty feeding the material. Telltale sign of that would be shortened stitch length. As you increase your thickness, you set your machine for nice long stitch length, and what you actually see is a shortened stitch length. Or if it loses traction, intermittently you'll see shortened stitch length, and we're not seeing any of that at this 4 layer level with the Pfaff. The other thing we can check is how well it balances a stitch on the back side of 4 layers. Again, we've set this machine so that it will perfectly balance a stitch in 2 layers of leather, and it should be very easy to balance a stitch in 4 layers of leather then, and no problem. We see a nice balanced stitch on top and bottom. Things are looking great. We'll go ahead and double that up. This will be a test with 8 layers of leather. Sometimes the challenge is just, can you fit the assembly under the presser foot? And I'm hoping high lift will give us an advantage here. We'll get that set and see how it does punching holes through 8 layers of leather with no speed reducer. We'll reverse a few just to check the stitch quality in reverse. And again, this is far and away more thickness than you would usually sew with any upholstery application, except just for a few stitches where you're crossing, like that example we talked about, a strap in a backrest cushion that was very thick. Okay, so now I just hit something hard. Okay, so anytime you hit something hard, you want to stop. What it means is the needle is being deflected enough to hit the guard down by the hook assembly. And so if you force it through or you just jam the pedal, boom, you'll get a broken needle. So we're going to pull this out and see what the obstruction is. Usually it's nothing, it's just that the needle is being deflected through the thick leather. So we freed the material, checked for any obstruction. There wasn't one. It does look like I bent the needle though. And so we'll pop in a new number 20 needle. The Pfaff 145 takes a 190 system needle. So we'll pop in a new 190 system needle in a size 20 and continue the test. Now with the fresh number 20 needle in there, we'll get started again and see how it does. I'll try to stay a little further away from the edge. Maybe approaching that edge was just causing a little bit of a needle deflection. Kind of the bend of the leather is right in here. And we are going to be using a number 20 needle on both machines for this test. And another interesting thing is I've actually modified my Juki 563 to take 190 system needles. Now, Juki 563 doesn't normally take 190 needles. Normally it would take a 135-17. We're sewing leather, so normally you'd have a 135-16 leather point needle in there. But I've actually modified it. I've changed the needle bar height on my Juki so that it will accept a 190 needle. The 190 system needles are longer, and I just find it works for more applications because you get to raise your needle bar. We'll look at it when we get up to the Juki machine, but because you raise your needle bar to convert the Juki over, it gives you a little more clearance here, and as your material thickness gets higher and higher, you won't run into a situation where your presser foot conks into your needle bar, which was a problem I was having with the 135-16 needles. And so it works great with the 190 system needles. The one thing I will say that I've run into on the Pfaff is with the 190 system needles, you are a little more likely to break a needle because the needle is longer for a given size. Now we could punch this up to a 20. Now here I've hit something hard again. It was in reverse. And so we'll free that restriction and see if we've actually bent the needle again, it looks like. Yep, so there's another needle. I think we've reached our functional maximum here on the Pfaff at 8 layers. Okay, so with 2 bent number 20 needles, I figured it was time to punch up the size. We went to a size 23 needle, still in a 190 system, but this would be the maximum size you could go for the Pfaff. So we'll see if that makes a difference just with a larger diameter needle. Keep things a little bit stiffer as we march along. Now last time I bent the needle, it was in reverse, so let's go all the way down to the bottom of the stroke, plus up a little bit, engage full reverse, and see how we do. So far so good with that size 23 needle. Handling it a little bit better. Normally I wouldn't go up to that high of a needle size just because it punches such a large hole in your material, in your leather. But if that's what you had to do to handle an extra thick project, I suppose that would be workable. We'll try this test on the Juki as well. Test it with both a 20 and a 23 needle. Give us a apples to apples comparison here. So that seemed to make a difference. The Pfaff seems to handle the 8 layers without too much trouble. I am making sure to go a little bit slow now because I have bent a couple of the 20 needles. But let's just see if we can run into any problem if we go faster with this larger needle. The other thing that happens as you go, it compresses the material a little bit. It's still 8 layers, but it's 8 compressed layers. And so the machine will have an easier time once it's got a row or two of stitches over it. But let's get out here to the edge where it hasn't been compressed as much. And let's see if we can cause any problems there with the 23 needle. And I'll just run down a little faster here. And looks like we broke the thread. We broke the upper thread, but I don't see any bend in the needle, so that's interesting. So let's do a fresh test with the 23 needle. We've got new leather in place here, and this is with the 4 layers. So we're gonna hum along okay on 4 layers, but when I get to the 8 layers again, I'll go a little slower and see if we can succeed with this Pfaff 145 through the thicker layers that gave us trouble earlier using a very stout number 23 needle. I'll run down another line of stitches here and then we'll double it up. In fact, what I think I'd like to do is create a ledge by doubling up just half of the leather, and I want to adjust the machine wing nut at the back for maximum steppage, and we'll see if we can just come up over this huge ledge that would give most any machines a lot of trouble, and we'll just see how the high lift does with it. Okay, so we're up on the thickness. That looks pretty good. I'm having a little bit of trouble pivoting just because my foot won't get out of the way of the material. Again, this is not compressed yet. This is the first time I've sewn over this area, but the Pfaff does have a lot of foot pressure, and that may be one thing that helps us in this situation. I'm going to back tack just a little bit to get away from the edge. There we go. And now I've got enough clearance to make that lift and pivot okay. There we go. And so now we're seeing it's compressing a little bit, and that just makes everything easier. So 8 layers, no problem with the thick needle. Look at how we're doing on the underside. Nice balanced stitches, really no problems at all. No change in stitch length, no shortened stitches. And I can follow a line if I'm careful about it. And let's go a little quicker and see if we can cause any trouble. We did break the thread, broke the upper thread, but it doesn't look like we bent the needle, so it may just be a limitation of the thread. This is a 92 weight thread. I wouldn't usually sew through 8 layers of leather going fast, but it seems like if I kept my feed rate down, it did no problem with the Pfaff 145. Bit of a limitation with the needle size though. Probably want to jump up above a size 20, maybe a 22, if not a 23 for these thicker layers, especially if you want to hum along. Let's look at the Juki. We'll recreate these same tests. This is my most commonly used machine, but we'll see how it fares against the Pfaff. Looks like I had a zipper foot on the Juki from the last project I sewed up. And so we'll switch that over for a 1/4 inch piping foot to match up with what we had on the Pfaff. That Juki has the benefit of that extra large U-style bobbin, so something to consider if you do very large projects like auto or home upholstery. And we'll see how the Juki does with just basic control. And so immediately what I notice is the Juki sews a little bit slower, owing of course to the fact that looks like our stitch length is shortened. So let's match that up with what we had on the Pfaff. About like that. But the machine sews a little more slowly, and that's just because of the speed reducer that the Juki is outfitted with. Otherwise, it's got the same 550 watt servo and small pulley that the Pfaff had. Okay, so let's see how we do with the control around the corners. I mean, this machine, it would almost be impossible to do a jackrabbit start. It just, I mean, its middle name is control, you know, so it, speed reducer and a servo is kind of like exactly what you want for control and leather. But you can add those accessories to any machine. Beyond that, we just kind of want to get a feel for the head itself. What does the head bring you, the machine, its features, its capabilities. Yeah, so this is very comparable in terms of control with the Pfaff. It's just that this has the capability to sew a little bit slower. I can turn up the power on my servo and still not worry that it's going to run away on me. As far as speed, you can still sew at a regular pace if you want to. It's just that you don't need to. You could dial the speed back if you want, and you could just crawl along stitch by stitch if that's what the project required. So those are the kind of things you can get from a speed reducer plus a servo combo. If you don't mind the humming of the motor, you can also get pretty good control by leaving your same clutch motor on there and adding a speed reducer to the clutch motor. So no problem there. I know this machine well, and I know that it has no problem with control. So we'll move on to kind of the torture testing situation and see how it does with thick leather. So I raised the step edge up to maximum on this machine now. For the control test, it was just about 3/4 of the way up. Now the step edge is at maximum. And again, the interesting point about this particular Juki is it's been outfitted with a 190 system needle. You can do that just by raising the needle bar and retiming it that way, and you get a little more capacity from the long needle. So we're just sewing in 2 layers of leather here with the Juki, and obviously no problem. I just want to take a quick look that my tension is balanced before we move on to the thickness test. And we've got dark brown thread on the top and light beaver on the bottom. Again, 92 thread and a size 20 needle. It's nice and balanced, so we'll start thickening things up. Okay, we'll fold this over for 4 layers of thickness now, and easily slides under the presser foot. Hold our threads back and we'll sew down a stitch. Similar to the Pfaff, no problems with the 4 layers. Punching power is just off the charts with this sort of speed reducer. It's a box style speed reducer, and that's unique because you can mount it where a motor normally sits on the table, and then your servo or your clutch motor just goes down below the box style speed reducer. So there's not a lot of fussing around to install it, and you can use your original mount holes in the table. So there are some benefits to a box style speed reducer. So I'm not saying this is completely an apples to apples comparison because the Juki has a speed reducer whereas the Pfaff did not. But I really didn't have any problem with the punching power on the Pfaff. It was more just the needle deflection issue. The motor had plenty of power. So we're doing pretty good through 4 layers. I think what we'll do is fold this over and see how we do with 8 layers on the Juki. Okay, we're starting in 4 layers, and we're going to attempt to walk up this huge ledge up onto the 8 layers, and we'll see how the Juki does. That's with a number 20 needle. So far so good with that. I do feel a little bit of resistance just trying to use my knee lift to get up above the thickness. So there's not that much room left in the clearance, even when I'm adjusted to max at the wing nut. But I'm not deflecting the needle yet. No needle bends or breaks, and this is through the 8 layers. Sometimes it's the transition that it's a better test than just the straight thickness. And so how well can you reverse before the material is really compressed? How well can you go onto and off of these big ledge transitions that can be very problematic for non-walking foot machines, or machines maybe that don't have a triple feed. Both of these machines we're testing, by the way, are triple feed machines. They have presser feet that are alternating on the top, walking foot basically, and feed dogs below, but the third element they have that some industrials don't is actually a needle feed as well. The needle is in the down position as the material is advanced, and that's what makes it a triple feed. So like to like in that sort of instance for comparing these two machines. But I can walk right up over that hill, especially now that it's compressed, no problem. And let's see how close our needle bar is to hitting our presser foot here. It looks like we stay good 3/16 above the presser foot at its lowest point. And that's one big advantage that I have because I converted this Juki to a 190 needle system. That was one issue when I was sewing at maximum thickness, just those rare occasions where I had to sew 8 layers. I would actually get a little bit of clanking between the needle bar and the presser foot, and that issue was solved years ago when I converted it to a 190 system. So let me try to go forward and reverse up this hill again. No trouble there. And I noticed with the Pfaff, one time I saw issues, it was when I speeded up a little bit in the 8 layers. So let's see maybe if the speed or reversing, we can simulate any of those problems that we were having with the Pfaff, which were pretty reasonable problems it seems because it was such a thick chunk of leather, and we were trying to sew a little quicker than I would ever do with a regular project. Okay, there, now we broke a thread. So at least the Juki has some limitation at the upper end. And yeah, we broke a thread here, so you can see we stopped forming stitches because we had no upper thread. So let's thread it up again and we'll give it another shot. Alright, so let's give the Juki another go. Back tack in the 4 layers of leather. Again, this leather is the same that we were using on the Pfaff. It's a 2.5 ounce upholstery leather. And I bet with either of these machines, if you used a heavy enough needle and you took your time with these real thick spots, you could probably get the job done just fine. But we're kind of trying to torture test them and see what that limit is. So we do fine if we go slow. Let's just see if we can chug along a little bit. Stitch in reverse and keep that 92 weight thread from breaking. Up and down over this big seam. Okay, there, it didn't want to back tack. So let's see what we're getting if we free up the material. I think it was just sliding on the leather. Wasn't really a mechanical problem. It was just wasn't getting traction because it was kind of sliding on the leather right there. Let's try that again. We'll start on the low side, the 4 layer side, and we'll just see if it can march up. I'm just giving it the slightest forward pressure. I'm not really helping it that much. Now both of these machines have been recently timed and oiled, and so other than conditional wear issues, they're both in good adjustment and working properly. So I would say the Pfaff H4 had a little bit more give above the 8 layers of leather. This Juki can just barely lift off of the compressed 8 layers. When I was first starting to sew, I was feeling that resistance as I was trying to pivot it. And now that I have it compressed with some stitching, I can lift the presser foot slightly off the material. So I would give the advantage to the Pfaff H4 for the ability to lift off the material further. Where the Juki wins, I think, is better control in the thicker layers when it's actually sewing. Actually, I felt less resistance to sewing. I had no needle bends or breaks. We didn't even have to go up to the size 23 needle. I'll do that just so we can compare things, but no deflections, no bent needles, no broken needles with the Juki, and that's with the same material. And I started with a loosely folded piece, just like we did with the Pfaff. It wasn't this pre-compressed one that we used with the Pfaff, so pretty good head-to-head test there, but I just had better results with the Juki. Again, this is converted over to a 190 system needle, so your results may vary if you're using a stock Juki. So we jumped up to the big 23 needle on the Juki here, so we'll see if that makes any difference. I didn't feel like I had to make that switch, whereas on the Pfaff I definitely ran out of steam and I was getting a lot of needle deflections and needle breaks. I had Pfaff 545 in the past. It was an H4 as well with the 190 needle system, and just in sewing projects I noticed that I got into a needle break situation a lot more often than I would with my Juki. That was back before I converted my Juki to a 190 needle system. Functionally though, I haven't had many needle breaks with this machine, even though it does use the longer needle. This is not meant to be a super functional test, but I just kind of want to torture test them and see what their upper limits are. The Pfaff, I definitely felt like it was at 7-8 layers and we were getting to the limit. Let's go ahead and double this up. We'll do the 8 layers on the Juki here. I'm hardly helping it along, just making sure it doesn't slip. And so we're up onto the 8 layers. This is with the big 23 needle. See if it makes any difference. You know, with leather there's a lot of friction, and so the one thing that larger needle may do for us is just let the thread pass a little more easily through the eye of the needle, and it might help us with some of those thread breaks. Now we do have a little bit of mismatch when we're using a 23 needle, because we're still using the 92/8 thread. So normally you would jump up a thread size if you were going to use a needle this big. Again, with leather you tend to use one size up needle anyway. For instance, a size 20 needle would be good with a 92/8 thread. But this is humming along pretty good. With the thick needle, I notice a difference. It's not struggling much at all. So I think it's just that larger opening size for the eye of the needle. Gives it that little extra room for the thread to come through and helps you deal with all the friction from sewing 8 layers of leather. Let's go along a little quicker and see how the Juki responds if we back tack and sew a little quicker. Look on the underside, and we're getting nice tight stitches, no loose loops on the bottom. I tell you what, let's throw in another 3/16 of thickness and see if there's any way that the Juki can stitch these two together. This is the cork plus veg tan leather. I just didn't even feel like trying this on the Pfaff because I was breaking needles so often, but the Juki hasn't really balked at me yet. So let's just take a look on the bottom side of this and see if we're actually forming decent stitches. Now I do have some trouble removing this because it's such a thick assembly now. There we go, just a little friction there. So one thing I noticed here, this is where I had to pull it out from underneath the machine. It was firm pressure there, but just for regular sewing I don't see that scuff line like I did with the Pfaff, so that's interesting. That was the veg tan leather. And this was our stitch line here, and so we did complete the stitch with that 190 needle system on the Juki 563. And so I definitely feel like the 563 does have an advantage in terms of how thick it can sew. which is interesting to me because we're comparing it against the H4, the high lift Pfaff. And that's supposed to be its big benefit, is it lifts higher and it steps higher. And here we've got the Juki 563, which has just kind of a standard lift, and it appears to be beating it, at least with the 190 needle system modification. All right, you guys, that's what we found with the Pfaff 145 versus the Juki LU 563. There's a lot of similar machines too. The Pfaff 145 has a big brother, the 545, which is very similar machine, top loading bobbin, but it features a M-style bobbin. So if you need the capabilities of a 145 with a larger bobbin, consider the 545 model or even the 1245 model. Same thing goes with the Juki 563. It's kind of the large bobbin version with that really big double size U bobbin. But if that doesn't matter to you as much and you're doing small wallets and belts and that scale of project, you might look at a Juki LU 562. It's got the smaller G-style bobbin. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you found a tidbit or two that was helpful here. Catch you on the next one.